So the crust of the Earth is not a solid sheet. We've seen that the lithosphere, the upper layer of the mantle along with the crust, is actually broken into fairly rigid plates. This figure here shows the major plates around the world, from the Eurasian plate, North American plate, the Pacific plate, so on. Now these plates kind of float on top of the asthenosphere, and then they move around on top of the asthenosphere. Now, if we were to plot earthquakes, volcanoes, and other very major changes in the natural disasters, basically, a lot of those earthquakes would form right along the boundaries of these plates. This is where you would see most of this seismic activity happening. This has to do with the motion of one plate against another plate. And we'll see that. There are three different types of motions that we can see. One is divergent, meaning the plates move away from each other. One is convergent, the plates move towards each other. So divergent means they're moving away from each other. Convergent means they're moving towards each other. And transform means they're moving side to side next to each other in opposite directions. Okay, divergent boundary is when two plates are moving away from each other. Now, when this happens, it creates a rift or a fissure in between the two plates, and then as they move away, the magma can then flow up through that fissure and thus build up the landmass around it. This is where the rifts come from. Ridges, such as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This is a new crust zone. The magma that comes in, cools down, forms the igneous rock to make brand new portions of the crust. Now, a convergent boundary is when two plates are moving toward each other. Now here, instead of just something as simple as magma coming up, forming new parts of the crust, it's far more complicated with a convergent boundary, because as these two plates move towards each other, they start to destroy parts of each other, at least. Whether they annihilate each other or just destroy the old crust, it depends on how they are colliding. One important point in convergent boundaries, an important definition, is the subduction zone. The subduction zone is the part of the crust that is subducted or pushed underneath the other plate. So plates come hit each other, one of the plates is pushed underneath. That is the subduction zone. Now, there are three different possibilities for convergent boundaries. You can either have continents and ocean plates, continental and oceanic plates converging, or you can have two oceanic plates converging or two continental plates converging. Let's look at all three possibilities. When we look at an ocean and continent plate converging, then the basalt at the bottom of the ocean is more dense than the granite that makes up the continents. And since basalt is more dense, it's going to get pushed downwards. This is your subduction zone right here. And notice that it forms kind of a valley along here. This is your oceanic trend that we talked about in the previous video. This is a great example of this would be the South American plate with the Nazca plate. Another good example would be the North American plate with the Pacific plate. With the coastal mountains that are formed here, because of this convergent zone, this would be like the Sierra Nevadas. And something important, something that happens in this type of subduction zone is you create new pockets of magma from the subducted plate. It creates these new pockets of magma, which then seep upwards and can turn into volcanoes. Well, there are a couple of particular mountains in the northern range of the Sierra Nevadas that are known for this, particularly Mount St. Helens. And so you have the Sierra Nevadas, Mount St. Helens, good example of a mountain range that is formed due to this oceanic continental plate convergence. You can also have an ocean-to-ocean plate convergence, where two oceanic plates collide with each other. Very similar, except that both plates are underwater. Basically, now it's just, they're both basalt crusts. You just take the basalt that's more dense and it is subducted. And as a result, the one plate that stays on top, the less dense oceanic plate, has volcanic activity similar to what we saw before, and that volcanic activity comes up into the ocean, hardens, gets some more volcanic activity, it builds up, until those mountain ranges are large enough that they will poke through the surface of the ocean. Classic example of this would be Hawaii, because this is how Hawaii was formed, was through the volcanic activity of two plates in the middle of the Pacific, causing volcanic activity there. The last type of convergence is continent-to-continent plates. So you have two types of granite that are just basically running into each other. Classic example of this would be the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate. Now, the country of India, many millennia ago, was actually an island. It was an island out in the middle of the sea, not unlike Australia. But that plate kept moving towards the Eurasian plate, and then eventually the continent of India and Asia collided with each other. And as they did, they buckled, and it pushed that rock up, creating the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayan mountains. Now, an interesting thing is that still today, because of plate tectonics, the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate are still moving towards each other. And so the Himalayan mountains are still growing today. The last type of boundary is the transform boundary, when two plates slide past each other. Now, crust is not created or destroyed in this process. It's just plates moving across each other. However, there are irregularities in the plates. It's not a very smooth boundary. And because of these irregularities, you get sudden jerks that produce massive earthquakes. The San Andreas Fault in California is very well known for this, as the San Andreas Fault is moving one direction, the North American plate another direction, causes lots of intense earthquakes in California. So here's a good picture of our present understanding. You have your divergent plates, which is where you have a rift forming as the plates move apart from each other. Magma comes up, you form new landmass, and you create ridges along those two plates. You have converging plates, where plates are moving towards each other, and then one is subducted, and it causes increased landmass due to volcanic activity and pushing the other plate upwards near where the subduction zone occurs. Now, and then you also, there's one other here. We also have the transform boundaries, where they are sliding side to side from each other. Now, there's one big question that still remains unanswered, and that is, what drives these plates? What's actually pushing the plates around? To be honest, we're not 100% sure yet, but we're pretty sure that it has something to do with the convective cell of the asthenosphere. What we mean by that is you have rising motion due to hot pockets of magma. Then when it reaches near the crust, which would happen near a ridge, such as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a lot of that magma is then pushed to the side. And then as it cools a little bit more, it becomes more dense and it sinks, where it is then pulled in towards that hot pocket again, where it pushes back up towards the ridge, and you've got yourself a cycle. That is the convective cycle. Some of the rising magma actually breaks through the surface, creates new land masses, creating these new ridges at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, so on. Now, here's the principal idea. As the convective cycle pushes to the side, it's going to drag the plates along with them. That's the primary idea of what drives the plates. The problem is we can't get into the mantle yet. We can do certain tests down there, but without actually getting down there and being able to take physical measurements, we can't get the evidence we need to support this. So we have very little supporting evidence of the convective cycle, the convective cell theory, but it is to date the primary theory of why the plates on the ocean move around.